The Wolf Among Us is a game full of mystery, intrigue, atmosphere, and brilliant writing. Despite originating from somewhat of a niche market, it almost instantly generated a dedicated following that stayed strong to this very day, despite of the roller coaster that came after the game launched. While not the most lucrative out of all products developed by Telltale, it did earn its place in what is considered to be a holy trinity alongside The Walking Dead and Tales from the Borderlands. A product of passion that has suffered from unexpected complications during the development, it came out on the other side as an absolute cult classic and even 10 years later remains to be one of the most beloved titles that came from under the Telltale's banner. So strap on your glamours, because we are going back to Fabletown to see what made The Wolf Among Us a true masterpiece of video game storytelling. To understand the greatness of The Wolf Among Us, we should first explore the hurdles it had to overcome during the development. The origin of the project dates all the way back to 2011, when Telltale Games had acquired licenses allowing them to create games based on both The Walking Dead and Fables. With the rising success of The Walking Dead as a franchise, Telltale has decided to put most of their focus into that adaptation, pushing the Fables game aside for the foreseeable future. In 2012, following the release and critical success of the first season of The Walking Dead, the developers were finally able to start full production centered around their Fables license. Despite finding their new game design formula to be a huge success, the narrative for the Fables game went through many iterations, as a discourse between the creator of the comic books, Bill Willingham, and the writers at Telltale has forced them to rewrite the story multiple times, even after the game launched. As such, the project went through numerous delays, but following the re-announcement and the reveal of the official title, The Wolf Among Us, in March of 2013, the game has finally hit the stores on October 11th of the same year. The Wolf Among Us has released to critical acclaim, and a big part of its success were no doubt the premise and the story. Much like the source material, the game takes place in a New York City, where a community of characters known to us from many tales and fable stories try to make a living under the guise of normal humans. However, the trials and tribulations they go through are far more fantastical and extraordinary in nature, as a lot of fables are in fact non-human and are forced to either use magic spells called glamours in order to pass as humans, or face being outcast into the farm outside of the city, where all dissidents, monsters and animals reside under what is a more or less a house arrest. Fabletown, as that is the name of the main bulk of Fable community set in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, has its own government, law and police force, whose main purpose is to maintain order within the community and prevent the regular people, who are referred to as Mandies, from discovering the existence and nature of the Fabletown. As expected, not everyone is able to afford to live in the high-end Woodlands building, which is the primary place of residence of the community and where most of the government-related business of the Fabletown is conducted. Some fables are forced to make a living out in the normal world, which in turn created many underground networks and crime organizations, exploiting the less fortunate residents of the community for their own profit. This kind of world building proved to be a perfect foundation for the detective stories, which is where our main hero comes into play. Bigby Wolf, formerly known as the Big Bad Wolf, once a source of terror in many of the stories we have heard in our childhoods, has ironically ended up being the sheriff and the sole member of the law enforcement of Fabletown. His violent and confrontational attitude, paired with the status of infamy with the other fables due to his past in the homelands, has resulted in a stained reputation within the community. Yet despite the prejudice Bigby has to face on a daily basis, he does have the best interest at heart, and does his best to keep his feral nature at bay. That is of course until someone in the community steps way out of line, but for the most part the journey that Bigby takes throughout the game is the one of redemption. That attitude is promoted and supported by one of his closest friends and allies within the community, a deputy mayor who turns out to be none other than Snow White. Her rather dark and twisted backstory that includes an assault at the hands of the Seven Dwarfs back in the homelands has resulted in a more nuanced and layered character than many may have expected. While on the surface level, Snow might come off as cold and careless as she conducts business in a very no-nonsense type of fashion, deep down she's in fact warm and caring. There are multiple moments during the game when the audience can pick up on the cracks in her seemingly stern personality, as her desire to make Fabletown a better place for everyone can be seen, even if at times it might not be immediately obvious. The chemistry between these two main characters is perhaps what made the story so enticing to follow. While at the first glance The Wolf Among Us is a detective mystery, there are many layers to the story and world building. The way the characters interact and influence one another during the course of the game is undoubtedly one of them, as Snow is able to tame and bring the best out in Bigby, while conversely he brings out the more rebellious side of hers. But the cast of the characters goes well beyond this brewing power couple. The rich assortment of fables we get to meet throughout the game includes the cowardly and treacherous Ichabod Crane, troublesome woodsman, daring and dangerous Bloody Mary, shady and cunning Crooked Man, as well as many more. The writing and characterization of these fables is one of the key factors that make the world of The Wolf Among Us incredibly compelling. While progressing through the story, we are not only curious and excited to see what familiar faces we encounter out in the Fabletown, but also what their personalities are, how much they differ from the stories we know, and how they are dealing with their struggles of living in the normal world. The way many of them are portrayed is not as black and white as it might seem, as they all have their own quirks, ambitions and agendas, resulting in a lot of them falling in a very morally grey area, which keeps the audience on the edge of not knowing who can be trusted or not. However, the great writing and characterization alone wouldn't have worked if not for the superb voice acting. It was the brilliant work of Adam Harrington, Erin Yvette, Molly Benson, Gavin Hammond, Dave Fennoy, Melissa Hutchison, Laura Bailey and many more talents that breathed life into these characters and made them believable and compelling. Another aspect of The Wolf Among Us that has played a critical role in its success was the atmosphere. The game takes full advantage of the comic book art style, utilizing a multitude of special rendering effects such as cel shading, outlined in-game assets and unique way of shadow mapping. The iconic 1980s setting has also allowed the developers to be creative with the lighting, and with the game often taking place indoors or during the nighttime, the bright and crisp neon lights often contrast with the dark and mysterious backdrops, creating an incredibly compelling world oozing with the atmosphere of neo-noir. But the incredible atmosphere of The Wolf Among Us is not limited to visuals, as the game undoubtedly wouldn't be the same without the amazing soundtrack composed by Telltale veteran Jared Emerson Johnson. From the gentle and comforting ambiences to intense and exciting action tracks, the score of The Wolf Among Us does a great job mixing the themes of 1980s New York City by utilizing the iconic retro synths, and the fantastical nature of the fables by integrating more floral and orchestral notes throughout most of the tracks in the game. More than that, even the UI and menu systems of The Wolf Among Us contribute to its atmosphere, as from the moment the players boot up the game, they are welcomed with a very unique main menu which is capable of instantly immersing the audience in the world of it. The Wolf Among Us is primarily a story-driven point-and-click game with some light exploration elements. While most of the action scenes are limited to simple quick-time events, the actual puzzle solving is very simple, as the base gameplay loop entails investigating points of interest in a specific order. Of course, there are both positive and negative aspects to such approach. While for many players the game might be a bit lacking in terms of interaction and engagement, it ultimately makes it much more accessible to a wider audience. As with the most Telltale games, however, the exploration or direct interaction are not at the forefront of the gameplay design. The primary element of the gameplay are the player choices. While during the years many fans have argued whether or not the choices in many of the games developed by Telltale actually matter, The Wolf Among Us is one of the games where impact of the choices is pretty evident. The story of the game is tailored by the actions and dialogue options picked by the player, and while some of the choices can in fact have physical consequences on the story, such as whether or not someone gets hurt, most of the choices in this game are about you as a player shaping your own image of Bigby Wolf. You can be compassionate, aggressive, assertive, obedient, violent or gentle, and of course silence is always an option. Your choices can affect how other citizens of Fabletown will perceive you, and depending on how you treat them, the word might get out and the future interactions with other characters may be more or less difficult based on your previous behavior. This approach has created a game that, despite the generally linear story, has some solid replayability value, as there is always a new path and angle you can try to explore to see how it affects Bigby's relationships with other characters. At the end of the game, all of your choices and the way you treated other fables can have an effect on whether they will side with or against you during the final trial, and even then your attitude still has a chance of affecting the ultimate outcome. In a classic noir fashion, the story ends on an enormous cliffhanger that leaves players with many questions left unanswered, or left up to their own interpretation. The many mysteries that still linger on players' mind even after completing the story is what allowed the game to spawn a cult following that continued to celebrate the game for years to come. From countless analysis, theories, fanart to fanfiction and forum games centered around the universe of Fables. The continued engagement of many developers and actors with the community has also allowed it to thrive even more, and with such strong fanbase it was only a matter of time before the calls for a sequel would begin to surface and spread at a rapid pace. Yet despite the incredible success of the game, countless praise from both the industry critics and the players alike, Telltale went on to focus on other projects in their portfolio, refusing to answer the questions regarding potential Season 2. "These lips are sealed" became a common phrase uttered by the developers, and as the time went on the community grew progressively more desperate, to the point of over-analyzing every word coming from the official channels. However, the deafening silence that went on for years was eventually broken on July 19, 2017. With the confirmation of a sequel being in the works, things were finally looking up, at least for the time being. Despite the game being originally slated for release in 2018, the delays eventually led to the fateful day on September 21st, when the majority closure of the studio has been announced. With the company going under due to the withdrawal of the investors, the fanbase was once again left heartbroken, as the prospects of receiving a follow-up to their beloved game appeared to be pretty grim. As many of Telltale's intellectual properties were scattered across different publishers such as DC and Skybound, an idea of a sequel developed by another studio has left a chunk of the community clinging to this last desperate sliver of hope, and despite the unlikely odds, in August of 2019 a miracle had occurred. A company known as LCG Entertainment, based in Malibu, California, has announced the purchase of the remaining assets that the original company has left after it filed for bankruptcy, taking over the moniker of Telltale to continue its legacy, and in December of the same year a follow-up to the first season of The Wolf Among Us has been announced to be co-developed with Ad Hoc Studio, a relatively fresh indie company founded by a group of former Telltale veterans such as Dennis Leonard and Nick Herman, who worked on some of the episodes of the original game. While Season 2 has suffered multiple delays, it couldn't have fallen into the better hands, and with the recent success of the new Telltale projects, alongside the involvement of the original developers, the hopes of a sequel delivering a strong follow-up to the first game are pretty high. After all, The Wolf Among Us remains to be deeply beloved by almost everyone who played it at least once, a living proof that with the confident direction, any genre can work within the comic book art style. A product of passion, a true neo-noir detective mystery filled with incredible atmosphere, it does and will continue holding a special place in many of our hearts.